It's great to see such a packed house tonight, and welcome Thanishta and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It really is a delight to have a full audience for this debate, this lecture this evening. We'd like to extend clearly a very special welcome to Simon Coveney, who has a very important job at the present time, critical, and it gets more difficult by the day by all accounts when we see the news today of further issues with the Westminster Parliament. Now, Simon Coveney has more than 20 years' experience in politics, holding roles such as Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government, Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine, as well as Deputy Leader of Fine Gael. He was a member of Cork County Council and the Southern Health Board from 1999 to 2003, and he was first elected to the Dáil in 1998, one of Fine Gael's youngest TDs, aged just 26. He held shadow ministries in the areas of drugs and youth affairs, communications, marine and natural resources, and transport. He went on to represent Ireland and the Ireland South constituency in Europe when he was elected to the European Parliament in 2004. Since his appointment to the role of Thanishta and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade in 2017, he's had that special responsibility for Brexit and the Irish government. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing his lecture this evening entitled Maintaining the Habit of Cooperation. Now, with Brexit looming, this lecture couldn't be more timely, given the continued uncertainties raised in the negotiations, and not least the issues around the Irish border. Brexit is one of the biggest challenges currently facing many sectors across Ireland and the UK, and indeed Europe. And Queen's, like other universities, has highlighted the issues that must be addressed post-Brexit. Access to EU research funding and collaboration, the status of current and future EU staff, student recruitment and mobility, and of course, for us, importantly, is the relationship with the Republic of Ireland. Now, since 2011, Queen's has secured over £69 million of European research funding. But more important, perhaps, is the impact of this funding in driving excellent research across the EU through collaboration. Collaboration that must continue for the benefit of science and society. So it's essential that our businesses and universities continue to have access to these EU funding opportunities and collaboration opportunities, and that we can continue to attract world-leading talent to live and work here in Northern Ireland. We currently have 807 non-UK EU staff members in Queen's and over 1,200 EU students enrolled. All of these people make an invaluable contribution to the university, to our society, and to our economy. To maintain our global international reputation and standing, it's absolutely vital that staff and students at Queen's should have ease of movement. Further, beyond Brexit, it's critical that we continue collaborations across Europe, and importantly for us, across the island of Ireland. So it's imperative to not only cement our relationship across this island beyond Brexit, but also to further develop it. Developing areas that drive skills through education, that drive innovation through research, and which in tandem can drive our economy forward with more skilled jobs. Opportunities such as in health innovation and data science can build on existing strengths on both sides of our border and unite the island of Ireland. To achieve this, to be successful, we also need a sustainable higher education funding system here in Northern Ireland to widen participation and to support our economy. Over a third of our school leavers seek higher education outside Northern Ireland, and only a third of them return. This will have a very detrimental effect on our ability to attract inward investment, to create jobs and develop our knowledge-based economy in our region, where Queen's already delivers £1.9 billion of economic impact every year to the UK economy with a benefit to cost ratio of 6:1. It's important that we nurture talented young people so that they can maximise their potential as global citizens and drive tomorrow's economic growth. We've also highlighted the importance of prioritising continued strong relationships between North and South, as we have done for many years. We've worked closely with our Irish universities south of the border, in particular Trinity College Dublin and University College Dublin, and together we're advancing knowledge and delivering true global impact. For example, our Institute of Global Food Security is leading one of the world's largest food safety projects across Europe and China, working with a coalition of partners, including UCD. Queen's academics are also leading the way in informing the Brexit debate. Katie Howard and David Finnemore, for example, have been working closely with policymakers and both the Irish and UK governments. They've been providing expertise, evidence and impartial commentary on the process. So, as an institution, we'll endeavour to make real progress through continued partnership, through collaboration and, of course, through debate. So, without further ado, please join me in welcoming and Taoiseach Mr Simon Coveney to deliver this evening's lecture.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, and I am conscious as a politician, it doesn't matter whether you're in Dublin or in Belfast, that just because there's a big crowd doesn't necessarily mean you're popular. People might be here for other reasons. But thank you for taking the time to be with me and with us this evening. Let me first thank Queen's University and in particular the Pro-Vice-Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor Ian Greer, as well as Ryan Feeney, Head of Public Engagement, for arranging this event and this opportunity this evening. I'd also like to congratulate Ryan on his recent appointment as Head of Communications for the PSNI. Ryan, I and my government colleagues wish you every success in your hugely important new role. As the Chief Constable, George Hamilton, said on your appointment, communications and engagement are key to further enhancing confidence in policing in Northern Ireland. And no better person to take on that challenge at this critical time, and I want to wish you well with that. Policing is challenged and changing south of the border too. And I think we are learning from each other, I hope, in terms of some of the challenges that we face in the future. I think perhaps it's also appropriate to remember this evening Ian Adamson, who died this morning, former Mayor of Belfast and of course Ulster Unionist Party MLA. I actually met President Higgins today, and I'm not name dropping, but we were at the Young Scientists competition in Dublin at the RDS, and he was the one who said it to me. He said, we've lost somebody very special today, somebody who I knew well, who had a real intellect and was a significant positive and driving force behind politics in Northern Ireland at some crucial moments. So I think people should know that he is valued in Dublin as well as I'm sure in this city as well. I'd also like to congratulate Queen's, of course, on your commitment to supporting an ongoing, thoughtful and diverse public conversation on some awkward issues these days. Indeed, we need to find more ways and provide more space for such public conversations where passionate beliefs and imaginative thinking can be aired in an environment that is calm and considered. Queen's public engagement programme is a wonderful practical example of how a university can bring that spirit and that open space to the benefit of an entire community. We need such debate now. It's badly needed in a number of areas. Today it is exactly 2 years since we last had a working assembly and executive in Northern Ireland. And of course a fully operational North-South Ministerial Council too, which is something that we deeply value. The vision of the Good Friday Agreement, endorsed by people in referendums north and south of the border, was for a broad, ambitious, balanced, if complex, settlement. Right at the heart of it was the idea that representatives of the people of Northern Ireland would come together and work on behalf of both communities and all of the people to show leadership and to solve problems democratically, peacefully, and through cooperation. This still should drive us all. The ongoing failure not just to restore the Assembly and Executive to full operation, but even to come together again and restart real negotiations, shouldn't be acceptable to anybody. I have regular conversations with the parties. I talk to the Secretary of State, Karen Bradley, all the time. This sense that the situation we find ourselves in is unsustainable, I think, is shared by everybody, including many of the parties that sometimes take the blame for providing blockages and so on. Everybody wants working, functioning government again in Northern Ireland. It should be, by far, in my view, the dominant political issue today. It has, however, in some ways been overshadowed and complicated by another pretty obvious question now. So while it is not what I want to focus on this evening, let me recognise reality and talk for a few minutes about the UK's exit from the European Union. I understand there might be those in the room suffering from Brexit fatigue. I sympathise with that as somebody who speaks about it for 6 or 7 hours a day at the moment. But I'm also conscious of the deep concerns that this long, important and uncertain process has raised for so many people. Across Northern Ireland, in border counties, across this island as a whole, and of course across Britain, and indeed across Europe. I'm conscious of the heat that has entered the debate in recent times, and the risk of misunderstandings and mutual mistrust. That debate is, of course, at an intense and very sensitive stage this week in Westminster. And I have no wish to do anything to complicate those deliberations or to make compromise more difficult. So let me simply be as open as I can be about our perspective and start from first principles. We didn't want the UK to decide to leave the European Union. We believe that the European Union worked for the United Kingdom as a whole and enhanced its role across the world as it does ours. And we believed that the European Union was better with the UK part of it, benefiting from its place in the single market and the UK's voice around the table of European leaders, and benefiting above all from the weight of its strong advocacy of a liberal and outward-looking Europe. Britain's global agenda has been a hugely positive influence on how the European Union has developed. The United Kingdom's approach towards fair and balanced competition across our single market has been responsible for much of the economic progress of the Republic of Ireland. And I think it is important to recognise, in our view, that the decision to leave the European Union of the United Kingdom is a lose-lose in many ways that needs to be recognised. I believe that the United Kingdom will be lesser for it, but I also believe that the EU will be lesser for the absence of the United Kingdom. And an EU with the UK as a member, thanks for that. Maybe we'll get everybody clapping towards the end. Now that would be an achievement. I doubt it somehow, but we'll keep trying. And an EU with the UK as a member of it has been a better place for Ireland too. Better economically, politically, and most importantly of all, as a context and support for an extraordinary positive relationship between our two countries in recent years. And our greatest achievement, perhaps, the peace process in Northern Ireland, and of course the Good Friday Agreement, 20 years old. However, we do respect fully the democratic decision of the UK electorate as a whole. And I think it is important to say that. And sometimes that's not something that people want to hear in Northern Ireland, a part of the United Kingdom that voted in a different direction. So we don't seek to undermine that decision. And we do not seek to use it to our advantage, as some people seem to accuse us of right now. Because frankly, in my view, there is no advantages behind this decision. to the extent that we have an agenda in the process of securing a withdrawal agreement, it isn't hidden. I can assure you of that. It's the first sentence in every intervention we make. We want to make sure that the UK withdrawal from the European Union doesn't jeopardize the foundation of the shared, peaceful future for everyone on this island, provided by the Good Friday Agreement and its content. That is our agenda. And that is really our only red line agenda in the context of how we've approached these negotiations to date. While, of course, we have other concerns that are economic, that are about trade, that are about third-level education, and so many other areas, our core issue, which we have prioritized from the outset, when others perhaps hadn't, was the issue of how do we protect this precious and fragile and delicate peace process, which is under some strain right now, I think most people would accept. And I'll say something else. We'll have an agenda in the future relationship talks too. It will be full-throated in support of as close and as positive a relationship between the UK and the European Union as is possible, because that is the way we protect ourselves and our relationships on this island. We have no interest at all in being in an adversarial relationship with the United Kingdom. We want to be partners. We have no wish to damage the relationship that we already have, and we want to protect and build on what has been won together. We recognize that people have genuine concerns in this process. I think it would be fair to say that they are fears in many cases. A change like that presented by Brexit raises great uncertainty about the future. For families, for businesses, for farm owners, for every citizen and every family, there is a connection with this change. Most of it poses real questions and potential threats. We have stepped up our contingency planning for a no-deal Brexit, as have the UK and the European Union. We published a long document on that in December, and we've already added to it since then. It's the only responsible thing to do in this situation, but we remain convinced that the best way to avoid that scenario is the ratification by the EU and the UK of the withdrawal agreement that has been reached through long and arduous negotiations. And can I say, as someone who has been involved in those negotiations, they have involved compromise on both sides. They have been hard won on both sides. And this idea that the deal is the deal that's on offer from the EU to the UK is not a fair description of what's happened. Much of this has actually been designed, or redesigned, I should say, particularly in relation to Northern Ireland, around red lines that have been outlined from London, that have posed real challenges to the EU. And believe me, when you travel to other European capitals, they ask searching questions as to how and why we have gone so far to try and accommodate certain circumstances and certain red lines that have been outlined by the British Prime Minister. So when I hear people painting this issue as a weak deal for Britain or a weak deal for the United Kingdom, whereby they are being offered something that is somehow unfair or undermining of the United Kingdom, when I know that's not true, having been involved in the process and having advocated, actually, for some of the changes that have been looked for and asked for by the British government in the context of a single customs territory as opposed to a Northern Ireland specific backstop. I find it somehow frustrating that others try to twist that into some kind of new conspiracy theory that the EU is somehow trying to trap the United Kingdom in its customs union. That was never the intention. It's still not the intention. And we will look to try to reassure and clarify in a way that I hope can help people move forward on the basis of trust. I hear and respect the deep concern expressed by some in the unionist community that the union may somehow be threatened by the provisions of the withdrawal agreement and the backstop, and that your sense of connectedness with Britain may be undermined. I hear that. I hear and respect the deep concern expressed by some in the nationalist community that Brexit may undermine the rights you had counted on as Irish and EU citizens, or undermine your very right to be Irish and European in the future, or sunder once again your ever closer ties and relationship with the rest of the island, with your fellow Irishmen and women. I see that and I hear it, and people, believe me, are pretty blunt when they talk to me about it. I hear and respect the deep concern of all those in Northern Ireland and across the island of Ireland who fear that North-South cooperation and the all-island economy will be damaged and stalled. And I hear and respect the deep concerns of so many on both islands that the sets of relationships at the heart of the agreement within Northern Ireland, between North and South, and between Britain and Ireland will be fractured once again, in a way that will result in us having to try and rebuild once again. For our part, we believe, for what it's worth, that the withdrawal agreement fully addresses these concerns in the most practical ways that we can. It has explicit assurances on the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, as provided for in the Good Friday Agreement, namely that there will be no change in that constitutional status without the agreement of the people of Northern Ireland, the principle of consent. It also has explicit assurances on unfettered access to all markets for Northern Ireland business, both within the UK's internal market and in the EU's single market, which, by the way, is a unique offering in the context of business and farming and agri-food and so on. Not an easy sell, I have to say, to some other parts of the European Union who question how we can offer unfettered access to a state outside of the European Union in the future to ensure that we prevent physical border infrastructure for all the reasons that I'll talk about in a few minutes. And I can understand that some people see this as some kind of contrived threat. Believe me, it's not. It is what it says in the withdrawal agreement for those, and I'm sure some of you, as many academics in this room, have actually read it. It's long, it's pretty complex actually, but it's self-explanatory when you read it. There is not a hidden agenda here around constitutional change. It's about actually trying to protect the status quo, given the fact that the United Kingdom have made a decision to move in a different direction. We are responding to that policy, which is not our policy, but involves us whether we like it or not. That's the position. It has explicit assurances on no diminution of rights resulting from Brexit. Now, this is a complicated area, and I know there are some lawyers in the room because I recognize a few faces. Providing explicit assurances on no diminution of rights resulting in Brexit is tricky, to put it mildly, given the fact that the United Kingdom, outside of the European Union, relying on its own court system rather than an EU court system in certain areas and categories, is taking on an obligation to ensure that there's no diminution of rights following an exit from the European Union. And I'm sure I'll get questions later on the complexity of that issue. And of course, the common travel area will continue to allow Irish citizens living in Britain and UK citizens living in Ireland to live, work, study, and have access to healthcare and social security as they do today. And you know, I am a product of that CTA. I went to university in England. I was in university in Cork too, but I was in university in England for 3 years. The British taxpayer paid for a lot of my education. I worked in Scotland. I'm one of 7 children. A majority of us have developed our career at different times in different cities across the UK. Just like there are so many British people who have developed careers in Cork and Dublin and Limerick and Waterford and Galway, and so many students that move and benefit from that special relationship that has been there long before either country decided to join the European Union. Indeed, on this particular point, I want to provide a categoric assurance that the maintenance of the common travel area, as agreed between the United Kingdom and Irish governments, with the blessing of the EU, will ensure that the entitlement of individual citizens north and south to move freely across the border and to access health, education and social welfare on the same basis as today will be unaffected. And let me just be very clear on that, because the EU, to their credit, have actually now made it very clear that one of the only things that will be resolved on a bilateral basis in terms of detail in the Brexit negotiations will be the CTA, the Common Travel Area provisions. And the rest of Europe essentially will ignore that and let us do it. And what that will do is it will create a special status for Irish citizens in the UK and for UK citizens in Ireland, which is very different to any other entitlement that other European countries will have. You know, and if you take a country like Poland, for example, there are more Poles in Great Britain than there are Irish. Irish people are the second highest number. Yet, we are going to have this special status across the United Kingdom, just like British people in Ireland will have that special status too. And I think people shouldn't underestimate the significance of that and the benefits of it too, for many people in this room, I suspect, but also many others who are going to follow. I know that there are some who feel that we haven't always struck the right balance in the Brexit debates. We've tried to take that on board too. These are UK decisions we're dealing with, in the referendum and afterwards in terms of setting red lines. But there is a responsibility in the Irish government to be clear, to make decisions on the basis of fact and detail, but also to choose our words carefully, because they do impact on how people perceive our motives. We know that. At all times, our overriding priority has been to ensure that there will be no return to any hard border between the two jurisdictions on this island, with all the negative impacts that would bring for the delicate balance of the peace process, for small businesses and farms dependent on seamless cross-border flows, and for people's day-to-day lives in border counties. We don't want the backstop for it to be some kind of trap, as it has been described, in which to hold the UK or Northern Ireland. Nor do we want the backstop as some kind of stepping stone to changing the constitutional status of Northern Ireland, although some would like us to do that. In fact, we don't want the backstop to be invoked at all, in truth. We want a future EU-UK relationship so close that a backstop is never needed. That is what we are working towards. Overall, we believe that the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration on the future relationship negotiated between the UK and the EU is a fair and balanced deal with compromises shown on both sides. We believe it opens the way for discussions on the future relationship. Once the withdrawal agreement is ratified, that will be positive, ambitious, and can be successful. A finalised agreement also secures the transition period in which those talks can happen, which is hugely important in giving certainty to citizens and businesses. If more time is needed to finalise a full deal, it allows for more time to be made. In other words, a key element of the withdrawal agreement is an agreement on a transition period. In other words, we hold what we have, we freeze regulation and conditions for the next 2 years to create time and space for businesses to plan for new realities and for politicians to put a future deal in place that can provide certainty for people. And if 2 years isn't enough, there is now a mechanism built into the withdrawal agreement text that allows for the UK to apply for another 1 year or another 2 years, if they want to, in terms of extra time for a transition period, to ensure that we put a deal in place that prevents the need to ever trigger a backstop. This is what's at risk at the moment, if we can't find a way of getting that withdrawal agreement ratified. And if a deal cannot be reached and the backstop is invoked, we will work with urgency and determination to support the European Union and the UK government in agreeing better and more sustainable arrangements so that we can leave the backstop behind. This can be done while also making sure that there's no hard border on the island of Ireland, which is a goal I think that everybody shares. The view that we have, though, is that border infrastructure could potentially become an unintended consequence if we don't have practical and real solutions to prevent it from happening. And those that advocate against the use ever of a backstop, temporary or not, have yet to come forward with a proposal as to how they would prevent it. And that's the truth. And I don't say that in a provocative way, it's just the truth. There is no slick technology that solves this issue for us. Because it's primarily about regulatory alignment that allows an all-island economy to function, as well as an all-UK economy to function, that solves this problem. Not hidden cameras or scanning systems. The backstop is there to ensure that there are no circumstances where there can be a hard border. In other words, this is about just killing this issue off and saying to people in Northern Ireland, you don't have to worry about this anymore. This isn't going to happen by default or by mistake. And let's concentrate now on building a future that doesn't have to worry about that kind of division or barrier between Northern Ireland and Ireland. Legal clarity is required to guarantee that a hard border can't be recreated in any circumstances. The backstop involves using, in my view, the only credible means currently available to us to achieve that end. And it is tightly limited to what is strictly necessary. Because what the backstop actually does is it requires alignment in the areas necessary to prevent border infrastructure. That doesn't mean there'll be no difference between Northern Ireland and Ireland. It means that in areas necessary to prevent border infrastructure or checks or customs controls or whatever, we are looking at alignment to prevent the need for that. Today, as you all know, the UK government published a document setting out some additional unilateral commitments in relation to Northern Ireland and to the backstop. We've been looking at it carefully, of course. The first thing I want to say is that we absolutely share that wish that the backstop is never used, and we want that deep and comprehensive future relationship agreement that avoids a hard border to be agreed by the end of 2020. Once again, I am adamant that we see it as an insurance policy, not a preferred option. That is clearly set out in the withdrawal agreement and was further emphasised by the European Council last month. We would also fully agree that it is very important that all the people of Northern Ireland should have a voice in the Brexit process through their elected representatives. This is exactly one of the reasons why we need an assembly and an executive up and running again and to be working well. And we shouldn't underestimate the impact that Northern Ireland's leaders speaking with one voice on key concerns could have. And if the backstop were ever used, their voices should be heard at that stage too. Of course, we fully expect the UK to fulfil its legal obligations under the withdrawal agreement, including the backstop, but we are completely open to looking at any further clarifications which might be helpful in terms of providing the reassurance in Westminster that will allow a majority to ratify this deal. And we are open to that this week as we are next. In summation, we believe that ratifying the withdrawal agreement remains the best and most realistic way of avoiding the chaos of a no-deal scenario. And let me just be blunt about this. A no-deal scenario is a really bad outcome for everybody. And anybody who tries to sugarcoat it, in my view, either doesn't understand it or isn't explaining it truthfully. We are putting hundreds of millions of euros into no-deal Brexit planning. The British government, I suspect, are putting billions of euros into it. Should it happen? Because everybody has to plan for the worst. But anybody who tries to paint this as difficult for a short period of time and then all will be well, I think really does not paint an accurate picture of what a no-deal Brexit means. And I hope maybe we'll get some questions and answers in that area, and I can explain why when we talk about some of the areas, whether it's aviation, whether it's fishing, whether it's environmental issues, whether it's movement of people, whatever it is. We believe that ratifying is the best practical way to safeguard the achievements of the Good Friday Agreement, which I know many of you in this room want to see protected firmly, while also delivering on the UK government's commitment to act on the Brexit referendum result, which, as I say, we respect. We need to remember that the Good Friday Agreement was reached at a time when British or Irish also meant being European, and when also many practical aspects of life in Ireland and the UK were being harmonised in a European Union setting that it was assumed would always be there. I don't think 20 years ago anybody could have envisaged that we'd have to deal with this challenge linked to the Good Friday Agreement. It was reached at a time when common EU membership removed the need for customs or regulatory checks or infrastructure. Then, through the leadership of those who reached the agreement in 1998, a settlement was secured that provided the pathway for the removal of security infrastructure too. Together, through the combined soft powers of the Good Friday Agreement and our common EU membership, it proved possible to tear down the customs posts and security towers and consign them to the painful pages of our past. And together, the Good Friday Agreement and our common EU membership brought us to where we are now, where every month there's almost 2 million cars crossing that border. People going to work, to study, to make deliveries to shops, to see the doctor, to see a friend, to seal a business deal, to attend a concert or sporting event, or whatever they're doing from day to day. And there, I would take a moment to assure anyone in the audience who may be irritated at what I'm saying about the border. We do fully recognise that there is a political border on this island, and that political border will remain in place unless and until the people of Northern Ireland decide otherwise, in line with the principles, as I said earlier, of consent in the Good Friday Agreement. But no one wants to see the unintentional loss of the enormous benefit that the border as it is now, seamless, unobtrusive, barely perceptible, brings to businesses and to families and to relationships on the island. In our efforts to protect the achievements of the Good Friday Agreement through this process, we have been very conscious of the difficulties of honestly discussing the risks and the unknowns. There is a delicate line to tread in speaking about the very real risks without exaggerating them, speaking about the probability of negative outcomes without increasing them, or being seen to leverage them, as some people have accused me of. We have a passionate belief in the sea change that the Good Friday Agreement brought to this island, and a corresponding deep-rooted fear of seeing that positive tide ebb away from us in the coming months. And to those who accuse us of being alarmist or exaggerating those risks, I think we only have to look around us at the political reality that we see today. Power sharing is in limbo. North-South cooperation is in limbo. The parties are not sitting around a table talking about their differences. The lack of practical discussion and accommodation is polarising attitudes more, not less. Brexit is polarising attitudes more, not less. Decent people making passionate arguments, totally contradicting each other, fearful for the future. The Good Friday Agreement sought to give all the people of Northern Ireland a feeling of security and confidence about the future, so that they could set about the work of cooperation in the present to leave the past behind. It was not meant to be an end point of reconciliation. It was supposed to set the stage for it. The Irish government takes seriously its responsibility, in concert with the British government, of course, to see the agreement implemented and protected in full and in all its parts. How the Brexit process goes forward is a deeply important question for people in Northern Ireland. Our whole island, Britain, Europe and beyond. But as it continues, we cannot let it paralyze our politics or our societies as we take on the other pressing challenges right now, or as we plan and prepare for building up our communities and our societies in the long term. I can tell you, nobody in the Oireachtas in Dublin got into politics so that they could spend years of their lives managing the impact of Brexit. And nobody got into politics so that they could engage in an unproductive standoff with other parties, north or south. We got into politics to help our neighbours and our communities, to help our towns and villages and cities to thrive and prosper and look forward with confidence. We got into it not to get bogged down in process, but to secure real outcomes, to deliver. And I think that's true for the overwhelming majority of TDs, MPs, MEPs and MLAs alike. Last year, we rightly marked the 20th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement, and we honoured those from across the political spectrum in Northern Ireland, and indeed from Dublin, London and Washington, and elsewhere, who made that achievement possible. We honoured them in this very university, and if I may say so, it was a very, very fine day for Queens. And rightly so. But life moves on. That's the truth. 1998 was the year I became a TD. There was an excellent book on the Good Friday Agreement written by somebody, Siobhan Fenton, some of you may know her, who was only 5 years old when that deal was signed. Here in Queens and in universities across the island, we have young people who weren't even born when the 1998 agreement was signed. Life moves on. It doesn't wait for Brexit. It doesn't wait for the perfect political moment to finally open up. To be honest, it doesn't wait even for hope and history to rhyme, in the words of Seamus Heaney. We have a generation growing up for whom these years, right now, will be formative to their political outlook. Not the heartbreaking years of the Troubles, not the tentative hopes of the ceasefires and the talks, not the extraordinary breakthrough of the agreement, not the false starts and wranglings that followed it, not the years of flawed but functioning power sharing, but this here and now, the absence of political cooperation, the absence of political contact, the absence of respectful political dialogue, the absence of political understanding and political compromise and political accommodation of each other, the very absence of normal politics. That's what people are growing up with now, the next generation of politician. Is that what we want? Is that what we can accept? If ever there was an acceptable amount of time to allow for parties to come to an agreement, that time has surely passed, given what's happening outside of our control and outside of this island that's going to fundamentally impact the way in which we live and interact with each other into the future. Whatever your view of what agreement should shape the UK's withdrawal from the EU, we need parties that come together and talk now about how to restore an assembly and an executive together, as well as fully functioning North-South institutions, so that together we can try and solve these problems rather than try to outmaneuver each other in small-time thinking, where we think we're getting wins versus competitors on this island, but actually we're all losing. And that's what's at risk here in the context of the bigger picture when it comes to Brexit. Whatever constitutional future you believe in for Northern Ireland, we need, and I respectfully suggest you need, the parties to come together now and start talking to each other honestly. And if you are committed to a Northern Ireland that's a place where people can start to run a business, employ people and contribute, where young people want to stay and not leave, and contribute and build their lives here, then we need the parties to come together now and start talking honestly. There is no scenario where that doesn't help. None. There is no scenario where surely that isn't a better outcome than what we have right now. There is no scenario where not doing it doesn't damage the painstaking progress that Northern Ireland has made and needs to continue to demand. We don't have a generation's worth of time to waste, only to come back to this and try to put together some kind of Good Friday agreement for slow learners. We don't have that time. And if we're honest, we are robbing a new generation of a future that we should be providing for them by not thinking about this a little bit more deeply. And I know some of you are looking at me and saying, he's talking from a place of comfort, raising a family in Cork on the other end of this island, largely unaffected by what happens on the day-to-day decision-making in Northern Ireland. And I respect that, and I understand it. But I have a responsibility in the Irish government right now towards trying to bring about change on this part of the island. And that is what I am sincerely and honestly trying to do, without, I hope, being seen as a threat to anybody. I'm not here to criticize or to take a swipe at anyone or any political party. There can be a lot of frustration expressed at the parties, and indeed with the governments too. Sometimes warranted, sometimes not. But it should be remembered that there isn't a party here that hasn't taken risks in this process to date. There isn't one that hasn't had to lead difficult conversations with their own members and indeed their own community to find the agreement and the compromise needed. It's not easy, but it's been done before, and I think there is a recognition that it needs to be done again. My point is, it's been 2 years. Standing here in front of you on the day that we've marked 2 years gone, I would be shirking my responsibilities if I said anything other than that. We've got to get to moving forward and finding a way to talk to each other that can allow that to happen. And we can't keep waiting for a better moment. A better moment that isn't the marching season. A better moment that doesn't involve difficult Brexit negotiations. A better moment that isn't close to budget time. A better moment that isn't when the parties are holding their annual conferences. A better moment because there's something happening in Brussels or Dublin or London that just makes it a little bit more difficult. It doesn't get easier. That's the experience that I've learned from trying to interact with politics in Northern Ireland. And our politics has to stop being so caught up in deadlock, in the present, that we have no space to engage constructively with the future or indeed the legacy of the past, for that matter. Because that legacy hasn't gone away. The framework agreement at Stormont House some years ago is the best chance that we have to deal with it collectively and directly. And it needs and deserves the support not just of both governments, but of all the parties in the wider community. And I know that's not easy for many people and many families. If there are some changes that are needed, let them be addressed. But this is another case of us not being able to afford to let time slip anymore. There's an opportunity now to comprehensively address the concerns, where we can, of victims and families. I think that if we don't take it forward collectively with due consideration, but also due urgency, there is a clear risk that we could lose this opportunity too, as others have lost before. That would be yet another bitter disappointment and another heartbreak that families who've lost loved ones surely do not deserve. And just as we work together to address the legacy of the past, we have a responsibility to work together to set out how we'll approach conversations about the future too. For anyone who wants to realize their desired future, they need to make clear how their vision has a space for all in it, in my view. A home for everybody, regardless of your identity or your past. That means more than just lip service, by the way, to inclusivity. It means listening to, valued, and with thought given to how Northern Ireland, whatever future constitutional status, can be a real and secure home for people of all traditions, and a place where they feel empowered and free to express every shade of their own identity. And if those are values you hold, live them now, is what I would say. Talk now, listen now, make that space now, respect fully the identities and the rich cultures of others that perhaps you have seen as others rather than neighbours. Build those relationships now. That will strengthen your community and your society no matter which future comes about. We all have our own personal views on the future we'd like to see for this island. But I am very clearly committed to the idea that the vision that I have and those that everybody else has are completely and permanently subject to the principle of consent laid down in the Good Friday Agreement. For whatever future you want for Northern Ireland, it must surely be about persuasion, not coercion. We have had too much of that, far too much of that in the history of this island. Instead, it has to be about uniting people more than territory. It has to be about bringing people together. No one should be afraid to express their vision for the future that they want. But everyone should be allowed to dream for the future and express that. To tell people that the road is going one way runs the clear risk that you will be heard as removing their freedom of choice, that the future is somehow preordained or fixed in a way that actually reinforces fears and vulnerability. And I've seen that take effect in communities that I've had the privilege to talk to honestly and in private. And that persuasion is not really required or is somehow a decorative add-on, whereas it is an imperative. And that goes for whichever constitutional future you're advocating for. It's pretty simple, really. We need to make sure that we don't let anybody be bullied in the future. And in the conversation, from my part, I can tell you who I will listen to most in terms of trying to design that future. I listen to those who approach these conversations with generosity, who listen as much as they talk, who listen to those who don't just talk about a shared future, but who are doing something right now to build it. I listen to those who are busy right now making Northern Ireland work for people, who are getting on with it right now to make all the relationships talked about in the Good Friday Agreement actually work and function. The Irish government wants to engage in exactly that way. I doubt we'll do it perfectly. We haven't so far. I'm sure we'll say things that people can reasonably hear much differently than we'd intended. But the Taoiseach and I, together with our government colleagues, have made it our business to meet with and listen to people from both sides of the community here about their concerns and their needs, particularly in relation to Brexit, but other issues too. I have plenty of meetings, believe me, where people tell me face to face how we're getting it wrong. And that's as it should be. And that's part of their right. We're also trying to be part of building that shared future, though. I am glad to be able to say, for instance, that this year we're expanding our reconciliation fund by at least €1 million to assist more groups and in better ways. Groups from all over Northern Ireland and the border areas who are doing phenomenal work, repairing broken relationships or building them where they've never existed. Youth groups, arts groups, sports clubs, victims groups, women's groups, communities at interfaces, schools, all the people who are doing their bit and drawing communities together instead of letting them drift apart because that's somehow the easier option. And we want to work in partnership with the British government to support the parties in getting the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement up and running again. The Assembly, the Executive, the North-South Ministerial Council, and indeed to have the First and Deputy First Minister participating once again at meetings of the British-Irish Council. And we want to work in partnership with the British government through the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference, which some people seem to see as some kind of threat. This is sitting around a table, two governments together, trying to collectively solve problems that we're both involved in. And some people see it as a threat. And through new structures, we are planning to develop also post-Brexit to try to make sure that the East-West relationship is protected, where governments and ministers meet each other, like we do today in Brussels, every couple of weeks, to get to know each other, build trust and friendship and understanding and so on. That's not going to be there in the future. So we've got to replicate something that allows engagement between two neighbours, two islands that have a long and in many cases tragic and strained history, to be able to look to the future with a lot more positivity and cooperation and friendship. I know we want to leave time for some questions, so I want to finish on one final thought. The European Union was a context for what has been called a habit of cooperation. As an idea, it has proven to be a brilliant one. It's an idea that when it comes to divergent interests and aspirations, it's not just a question of vicious circles. There also can be virtuous circles, where cooperation leads to more cooperation, until it becomes a habit, a reflex, even an assumption that people take for granted. Where the idea of working together isn't the end goal of the process, it's the presumptive approach to all the challenges that come along when we're trying to find ways of overcoming them. It's the reflex we need to keep when it comes to Britain and Europe, in or out of the European Union. That cooperation should be a default, and we need to try and protect it. And it's not different when it comes to the political process in Northern Ireland or North-South cooperation or the relationship North-South either. We want a habit of cooperation, a mindset of cooperation, to be the hallmark of all three relationships for which the Good Friday Agreement was designed and founded. That is the approach of the Irish government. That's what we want. I talked earlier about what our agenda is. That's our agenda. To try to make these relationships work for everybody in a way that people don't feel threatened, marginalised, or vulnerable. So I want to thank you for welcoming me here this evening. And I look forward to your questions genuinely. Feel free to be as blunt and as open as you want to be. I suspect you will be anyway. And I'll try to be as open and as blunt as I can be in my responses. So thank you very much.
Some water. So we move to the open session for tonight, and we have some time for some questions. So just with the Taoiseach get some water and settles himself, I'm going to go around the room. I'm going to be as fair as I can in terms of getting as many questions as possible. If we get tight for time at the end, I might ask a few people to ask questions and we'll get a response then from the Taoiseach. But I'm going to abuse the position of chair and ask the first question, Taoiseach. You talked about the restoration of the executive and about the importance of that being a priority for 2019. How optimistic are you that we can get into functioning executive this year?
Well, no, I mean, I would be very optimistic. I take that. I hadn't finished the sentence though. I would be very optimistic that we can get a functioning executive this year, but I think we need to be realistic. The the time and the strain that is being caused by the ongoing uncertainties around Brexit mean that I think it is very difficult to see an executive, despite what I said earlier, where I believe there's a responsibility regardless of Brexit. In fact, there's a responsibility because of Brexit, in my view, to get an executive up and running so that Northern Ireland can be discussing these things in a way that can protect their citizens, because I do believe that there is real vulnerability linked to Brexit in Northern Ireland as well as Ireland, as well as across the UK. But I do believe that between now and the end of March, we have to find a way of achieving certainty on Brexit, at least getting to the next stage, whereby there is hopefully a withdrawal agreement agreed, where we're into a transition period for somewhere between 2 and 4 years, as everybody designs a future relationship that hopefully can work for the UK and for the EU. I believe if we can do that, there is no excuse, in my view, for parties then not to come together and work together. And I believe that people should be quite demanding around that. I think to be fair, all parties say to me privately that they want to be back into functioning executive. But as everybody understands only too well, wanting to do something and actually making it happen in the complexity and the division of the current Brexit debate is not easy, because everybody is looking for and trying to influence outcomes linked to that. But no, I mean, I'm optimistic, by the way, on Brexit too. I think we can avoid a no-deal Brexit. We can get into a transition period, or we can find ways of creating certainty that then can allow for the excuses to be removed in Northern Ireland. Because I think there's a real imbalance at the moment. I don't believe Northern Ireland's voice is being heard. And it's wrong that I am speaking for Northern Ireland to try to give a perspective, or that one party is speaking in Westminster, for example. That's wrong. And that's, by the way, that's not a criticism of the DUP. Of course they will advocate for their perspective in Westminster. They're there, they're elected. But the truth is that I don't believe the British public gets a balanced Northern Ireland perspective on the concerns and aspirations linked to Northern Ireland pre- and post-Brexit. And that's why I am probably more vocal than some people in Northern Ireland would like me to be, because I believe I have to try and provide that balance at times. But no, the straight answer to your question is, if we can resolve the Brexit issues, which many of us are working very hard on trying to do, I believe that we can actually, despite the fact that there are local elections coming up in Northern Ireland, of course that could be used as an excuse. We can't do it before that. Then we'll be into a marching season. People will say, oh, we couldn't do it during the marching season. Then we'll be into the autumn and the party conference season starts. We couldn't do it before that. Like, there's always an excuse. But it's 2 years now. And you speak to frustrated civil servants in Northern Ireland who are, in my view, doing an incredible job trying to actually manage the absence of political decision-making and allowing this economy and this country to run in the absence of governance and decision-making. But look, I think the parties know that, and that is why, in my view, we can find a way of working with the parties to get devolved government up and running, even though many people are pessimistic about it. When the Good Friday Agreement was struck, the week before, people were writing off the chances of a deal. There was no optimism that would happen. And it actually happened quite quickly. It took everybody by surprise, and I believe it's possible for change, positive change, to happen quickly, mainly because I think people are fed up with the negativity and the disillusionment with politics that comes with that is something that I believe all parties want to respond to positively, and we want to help them do it. But I have to be realistic as well. It's difficult to see that happening in the context of Brexit, which really is all-consuming for not only British politics, but also politics on this island.
Okay. Gentleman over here, I want a student to ask the first question, so just go over here. I know a few people have indicated, Alistair. So there's a roving mic, Alistair, and you'll lead on each side. So when you get the mic, then ask the question. Just there? Yep.
Hi Simon, my name is Cathal O'Hagan. First of all, fantastic speech. The last, a very strong point that came across was that there's never going to be a perfect moment for any type of action. Coming into the year of the centenaries of the Irish state, do you not think it's time that Fine Gael might start to organise in the north, and would you like to see that? And if not, why not?
Taoiseach?
Well, we're starting with an easy one there. Look, I mean, first of all, I would like to see Fine Gael have a presence in Northern Ireland. I hope that the kind of politics that we advocate for, which wants to respect all communities in Northern Ireland, their identity, and wants to help people live as neighbours in a way that moves on from a lot of the divisions of the past. You know, I'd like us to contribute to politics in Northern Ireland. It's a difficult political system to break into, though. Let's be honest, because in many ways politics in Northern Ireland is sort of intra-community as opposed to inter-community, if you know what I mean. You know, that's a big challenge for politics in Northern Ireland. But you know, like, there's a deep interest in my party, just as there is in others south of the border, in the future of Northern Ireland, its people, the relationships we have together, a deep interest. And you know, I'm conscious that when I say that, it irritates some people who see me as a minister from a foreign state, and that's fine too. And the beauty of the Good Friday Agreement is it respects both of those perspectives. But there are people who consider themselves as Irish, as people coming from Cork, living in Belfast and Derry and elsewhere. And for them, I represent a government that they want to talk to. And as I say, people who see me as somebody from a foreign state. So, you know, I hope by being consistent and just by being upfront and honest with people that I'll gain the respect of both communities. Fine Gael actually are hoping to launch their first Young Fine Gael organisation in Queen's in this university in the coming weeks, I hope. But you know, it's a big step to actually enter elections here. I'd like us to do it, but you know, I'd like us to do it in a way that's successful and at the right time. And to be honest, you know, there are big issues that I have a responsibility to help solve with parties in Northern Ireland at the moment, and I need to have a good relationship with all of them. And that's what I'd like to do, rather than actually competing with them in the short term at the ballot box.
Okay, Jane Morris was the second person with her hand up, and then Alistair will come down here after. So.
Thank you very much. Turning it on, yep. Jane Morris. My old hat was the Women's Coalition here in Northern Ireland, and now my current hat is the European Economic and Social Committee, and thank you for that fascinating address. I wanted to ask you on one particular point, which I think is a bit of an elephant in this room, perhaps. You mentioned that there be no diminution of rights of the people of Northern Ireland in the withdrawal agreement, and I would like to know how that would relate to the European elections and the fact that the European right to both vote and stand in the European elections. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what's meant by I mean, when the Good Friday Agreement was struck, and the rights that are in it that we are trying to protect, whereby there is, you know, no discrimination based on identity or where people come from. I think, and we've spent a lot of time actually trying to categorize what rights we're trying to protect here. But I think to make the case to the EU that a state outside of the EU would be able to elect members to the European Parliament and to be part of determining decisions that would apply to the European Union but potentially not to Northern Ireland. I don't think that's realistic. I have said before, though, depending on the kind of future relationship that is negotiated between the EU and the UK, depending on how close that relationship is in terms of single market or customs union or whatever, if there are decisions being taken in Brussels, then I think we need to find ways of ensuring that Northern Ireland has some voice in terms of how those decisions are made, or at least is heard. And I've raised things like, for example, whether or not Northern Ireland could have observer status in the European Parliament, for example. You know, if you look at accession states, they have observer status for a number of years before they join the European Union to sort of understand what's going on, because they need to create parallel economies essentially to the European Union before they join, which is the term full alignment with the rules of the customs union and single market and so on. So I mean, there are models that I think we have a responsibility to look at, but I think that in many ways will be determined by what the future relationship looks like. How close is it? If Britain is looking for harder separation, then I think that's a more difficult conversation. But we have very strong guarantees in writing from the British government that they accept the responsibility to ensure no diminution of rights from the rights that Northern Ireland citizens enjoy today as European citizens in terms of the rights that are linked to that. But there is a difference between rights that come with residency and rights that come with citizenship. And that distinction is part of the discussion here, where I think we need to be realistic. So in other words, EU citizens outside of the EU, once they come into the EU, they enjoy rights of EU citizens. If they're resident outside of the EU, they aren't always able to benefit from the rights of EU citizenship outside of the EU, because residency and citizenship sometimes means different things. So I hope I haven't added too much confusion there, but the rights issue is a complex debate. We have spent many hours on it, and obviously our agenda is to try to ensure that as many rights as possible are held onto by citizens in Northern Ireland, including, for example, the Erasmus programs, the European health card, so that if someone from Northern Ireland is travelling through the European Union, that they're covered and can go to a hospital, that they can go and work and study if they want to as an EU citizen, if they decide to do that, not just going to Dublin, to UCD or Trinity or somewhere, but to go to Paris or Berlin too. And I think we've made a lot of very positive progress on that area, and we will get a lot of that in the withdrawal treaty, and there will be a continuing discussion then in terms of the future relationship as well on the rights agenda, to ensure that hopefully everyone in Northern Ireland continues to get the benefits of being an EU citizen, whether they're a student or whether they're seeking healthcare supports or whatever, or obviously in employment rights and access to the workforce and so on.
Hi. I think my question comes back to what you were saying in your last visit here. Remember, renew and reconcile. And beforehand, your predecessor, Charles Flanagan, and then Simon Harris was here in Belfast last summer, and they both made the statement at the start of their speeches, I remember clearly, that this government, no community will be left behind on the island of Ireland. I guess my question at that point is, how could you make sure that the unionist community does not get left behind? I know you've talked about the importance of that. How can you bring them along in case there is a United Ireland, or in this case, Northern Ireland being probably you could argue a failed state at this point with a lack of government, or give them that space to remember, renew and reconcile, and to not be left behind in that case?
Yeah, I I've learned a lot in the last 18 months, actually, about unionism. Mainly that, the main thing I've learned is that I didn't understand unionism before this job. Still don't, probably, but I'm learning, trying anyway. You know, I mean, I think it's important for me to say that, you know, being British on this island is part of who we are. For many people, being Irish on this island is part of who we are for many people. And regardless of what happens in the future, whether or not there's constitutional change or not, in the next, whatever, 50 years, that people who see themselves as British in Northern Ireland today will continue to see themselves as British, and people who see themselves as Irish will continue to see themselves as Irish. The question is, how do we create a future where majorities that potentially become minorities don't feel vulnerable and exposed, and where they feel welcome and at home, and that is why I think the Brexit debate is just so negative on this particular issue, because what it does is it forces people back into their identities. It forces people to look for the bully in the schoolyard rather than the person who's trying to reach out, because that's the person you go to if you're fearful rather than confident enough to be able to express your identity fully. And that's why it's had such a corrosive impact, to be honest, on the ability to be able to get devolved government up and running, to get trust between parties and leaders again, where so many people are watching a debate in London when actually they should be having a debate here. But look, I mean, from my perspective and my political party's perspective, we have aspirations for the future that I don't think is any secret to anybody, but we are a party that wants to try to unite communities around a common vision and a common goal, regardless of the constitutional status that people vote for. But it's very hard to have an open discussion on those issues in the context of some of the other things that are happening around us right now, because people lose confidence and become much more rigid in their view. If you feel threatened, you tend to build fences around you rather than actually invite your neighbour in if they're different. And that's the problem, which is why I think a lot of the commentary around, the inevitability of change in Northern Ireland, or demographics means this, which people are afraid to talk about publicly. Like, it's pretty unhelpful discussion, our language, because what it does is it immediately raises the hackles on the other side. But look, you know this a lot better than I do. I'm somebody who is trying to provide, hopefully, honest and imaginative thinking to how we can put structures in place that help us deal with these historic issues that are very, very difficult and sometimes very divisive.
Second rover, yeah. Chris?
Hi, Chris Donnelly. I was actually going to ask a question related to what Jane Morris had said about the idea, and when the Irish government had received 2 extra seats, MEPs, had read one report, I think it was from Mark Bassett, that said that it could have been feasible for the Irish government to create an additional constituency to allow Irish citizens in the north to vote for European elections. But I think it's on a similar theme. Later this year there will be the referendum to allow Irish citizens residing abroad and in the north to vote for the Irish presidential election. And I just wonder, in terms of your own position, how important do you see that? And perhaps looking forward, Simon, do you see it as, in the theme of your talk about relationships, forging relationships, would there be potential in the future to open out beyond Irish citizens in Northern Ireland to others, perhaps British citizens in Northern Ireland, to participate in voting for the Irish president?
Yeah. A couple of questions there. I mean, first of all, the concept of creating a constituency outside of the European Union, where only a portion of the citizens could elect an MEP for a parliament that may not be able to make decisions for Northern Ireland, we would first of all have to get agreement across the European Union on that, and I think that would be very difficult. We did have that conversation, but don't forget that the Good Friday Agreement talks about ensuring that communities are treated equally regardless of their identity and so on. So are we talking about here creating a voting right for Irish people but not British people in Northern Ireland? Is that consistent if you flip the coin in terms of the Good Friday Agreement around giving one community access to influencing political decisions and the other not? I've always made the case that whatever rights we create for citizens in Northern Ireland, everybody should be able to access that. So I think that we'll continue to have the conversation around, depending on what the future relationship decides, or depending if a backstop is ever triggered for a temporary period, where decisions may be taken that impact on Northern Ireland, and therefore Northern Ireland has to have a say on, which I think is what the British government were trying to address that issue today in the paper that they published. But I think there's still quite a lot of talking to be done in this in this area yet. In terms of, I can be very categoric on the other issue. I am a big advocate for allowing Irish citizens all over the world to vote to elect a president for Irish people in the future. I was the person who essentially brought that to government. I'm still the person bringing it to government, although from a different. When I was in the Department of Housing, that's also the department that's responsible for elections. And so we designed the options available for a government to choose from. We published 7 options that a government could choose from in terms of how we would allow citizens to vote for Irish presidential elections in the future. And the Taoiseach and I are very strong advocates of following through on that now. The question is, when we hold that referendum, we'd like to do it this year, but we want it to be successful. To hold that referendum and have it rejected, I think would send a terrible message, not only to Northern Ireland and Irish citizens here, but also to so many Irish citizens in Britain, US, Australia, Canada, and so many other parts of the world as well. So we want to get this done, but we want it to be successful. And we want to reassure people that may have hang-ups or concerns about it. But mark my words, as far as I'm concerned, I'd like everyone in this island who wants to register to vote to do that. Simple as that. As far as I'm concerned, we're electing a president who will be representing Irish people all over the world, and I think can play quite a powerful role. We have an extraordinary diaspora that I think is yearning to create a stronger connection with Ireland, and I think this is one of the ways in which we can make that connection real. But there's not universal agreement across all political parties and all people within political parties on this issue, but I can promise you both the Taoiseach and myself will lead on this, and we'll make it happen.
Okay, we have several questions on this side, up the very back.
Are there not 2 contradictions in your remarks, in that you say the withdrawal agreement represents compromises which cannot be compromised upon further, and those who would result from those compromises cannot be indulged? But with regard to getting Good Friday Agreement institutions off the ground, your government calls for further compromise on the existing compromises of the Good Friday Agreements, St Andrews Agreement, Stormont House Agreements. And secondly, when you say there's no point waiting for a perfect moment for change, is that not the position you're taking towards Irish unity? When President Higgins visited Windsor in 2011, it was said that it was wrong to talk about Irish unity when the relationship with Britain was so good, and now it's wrong to talk about it because the relationship is so strained. So there never will be a perfect moment, will there?
Right, a couple of questions there. First of all, I don't think there's any contradiction in what I'm saying on the withdrawal agreement. I mean, the way international negotiations work is that you spend as much time as is necessary to get a deal done. In this case, 2 years. This is a deal between 27 governments on the EU side and the UK government on the other side. It's not a deal between Ireland and Britain. It is an agreement that was signed off on by the British government and an agreement that was signed off on by the other 27 as well and the EU institutions. And it involves lots of compromises. I can give you loads of examples. What I'm saying is we have 78 days left before the United Kingdom leaves the European Union. The idea that we can renegotiate now a deal that took 2 years through very fractious and difficult and in many ways hard-won text on both sides. The idea that we can open up that now and just do little bits here and there without opening up a whole load of problems, I don't think that's realistic. And that's why people like Donald Tusk and Jean-Claude Juncker have made it clear that, look, of course we can provide clarifications as to why compromises were made. We can provide reassurance where there are concerns. But to reopen the legal text on the withdrawal agreement, whatever about the future relationship declaration, I think that is probably in a different category. I think once you start unpicking that legal text, you create new problems that then needs to be solved. And I think it's just really difficult to see how that could be done in the timeline that's available. I haven't actually called for compromises for the Good Friday Agreement. What I'm talking about is actually protecting the Good Friday Agreement in full. And we painstakingly put together, both the British government and the EU side, involving a lot of Irish government input, a withdrawal agreement that does that. When I talked about the Stormont House Agreement, actually I'm a big supporter and defender of the Stormont House Agreement. If some people have issues with it, we need to talk about them. But I'm not suggesting that we need to advocate for compromise unless it's necessary to do it, unless everybody recognises that and is willing to. I'm not. And on the other point you make around when's the right time to talk about, Irish unity or, no matter what I say on this issue, I seem to get criticised. I've been asked an honest question and given an honest answer in the past, and I got criticised for it. Now my focus is on trying to get a settled deal that can reassure everybody in the context of Brexit. I think having debates around Irish unity at the same time as doing that, is a bit like pouring petrol into a furnace that's already pretty hot. Because one side just sees it as a threat, and it feeds into the view that some people have that this is a conspiracy, that the Irish government is using the Brexit challenge to try and advocate for constitutional change, which is just not true. So we're trying to protect the status quo. Actually, we don't want things to go backwards. Of course, other people will talk about their aspirations for the future, and I shouldn't be criticizing them for doing it. My criticism has been of people who we're trying to work with to get compromises that can allow us get through this Brexit challenge with as few scars as possible, so that when we get out the other side, we can fix a whole lot of other things too. And I just think the time for a rational and respectful debate around people's aspirations for constitutional change on this island, or not, depending on your perspective, to have that at the same time as trying to find a way through in terms of Brexit, I don't think that's wise, and I don't think it's helpful.
Okay, we're tight for time, so I'm going to cluster the next three questions together. There's a young man here in front of David Gavigan who's come in a school uniform, so I want to get him to ask a question, and then we'll take two from the front. So,
Mr. Coveney, I'm one of the young people you spoke of who was born after the Good Friday Agreement, and you strike me as caring about the aspirations of young people. So in the context of 1 million young people turning 18 after the Brexit vote in 2016, and many more who are still not of voting age, what do you think about the calls, or about the sense that democracy didn't expire in June 2016, and calls for a second referendum in which more young people would have an opportunity to make their voice heard?
Okay. Well, hold that thought. Just second row here, second row back. Okay.
Thank you. It is not a question, but it sounds a bit sappy. I just wanted to say thank you. As an Irish citizen living in the North and someone who's a very proud supporter of the European Union, I don't even want to think about where we would be if not for the thoughtful leadership of the Irish government. So I just want you to know that it's appreciated, and please, whatever you do, don't stop doing it. Thank you.
Professor Paddy Gray, and we'll cluster the three, and then we'll take two more over here, and then we're going to draw it to a close. Paddy.
Sorry, thanks very much, Ryan, and I really enjoyed, Taoiseach, your speech, but the very first question asked you about the return of an assembly and the possibility. I'd like to turn it the other way. Your government at the moment in the South, there are a lot of domestic issues, particularly around housing, and you're a former housing minister, obviously. How are you confident that that government will remain in the longer term over the next year, or will something happen in the near future where the government could fall, which would have a major impact on what you're doing on Brexit?
Yeah, well, let me start with that one first. Well, look, I'm someone who chaired our negotiating team to extend the Confidence and Supply Agreement before Christmas. And I'm someone who was very involved in putting the Confidence and Supply Agreement in place 4 years ago, when many people thought the current Irish government wouldn't last 6 weeks, never mind 6 months, never mind 4 years. We do have an extraordinary political situation in Dublin right now. Fine Gael got 26 or 27% of the vote in the last general election, and we have partnered with a small number of independents, and we've been running the country since. But we're running a minority government. It's a significant minority. It's not like Theresa May, who's just on the edge. And we rely on a deal with the main opposition party, Fianna Fáil, to be able to run a government. And sometimes that relationship is strained, but I think to some extent, the aftermath of the last election, while it took 74 days to put a government in place, which is a very long time, it does, I hope, reflect sort of the maturity of the Irish political system. I hope that actually when people saw the only other alternative was to go back to the electorate again and probably get the same result, there was a need for large parties to work together to allow a government to function. And that's happened. And I think the maturity of the decision in December, when Fianna Fáil decided to extend that Confidence and Supply Agreement by another sort of 14 or 15 months, because of Brexit. Basically, Micheál Martin's view was that Ireland doesn't need a general election in 2019, given some of the potential decisions that we made and the enormity of some of those decisions that we may have to make in the context of a no-deal Brexit. That will impact on Northern Ireland too, by the way. And for the unionists in the room, whether you like it or not, we all live on this island together. And the decisions we make impact on you, and the decisions that you make or that London makes on your behalf impacts on us. And we will have to plan for how we allow normal trade to try to continue, while at the same time fulfilling our obligations as an EU member in terms of protecting the integrity of its single market and customs union, which is going to pose all sorts of challenges potentially in a no-deal scenario that we all need to wake up to. Because, believe me, it will impact on Northern Ireland. And I don't say that in any kind of an alarmist way, I hope. It's just reality. If you're a dairy farmer, you'd know why. If you're a fisherman, you'd know why. If you're a doctor in Auchnagalvin Hospital with patients from Donegal, you'd know why. Even though I think we will be able to solve many of those issues, I hope. So no, I take your point. We're not in any position to lecture other governments. We've a commons and supply arrangement as well. But I do think there's a pretty stark contrast between what was happening in Dublin in December, when the main government and the main opposition party decided we got to work together for the next year on Brexit, and what was happening in Westminster when the main opposition party is doing everything it can to try and pull the government down, with only a couple of months to go before one of the biggest decisions that the United Kingdom has made since the Second World War is about to take effect. It's extraordinary. And so, my frustration, let me be very clear, is not only with the government party in Westminster, it's also with the main opposition party, who has the power to be very influential and very constructive, if they choose to be, in terms of trying to provide certainty for everybody. But look, I need to be very careful with what I say, particularly this week, and I'm conscious of that. This is a decision for Westminster and the British Parliament, not a decision for me. And I have to respect that. This is a ratification process. The deal has been struck and signed up to by the British government. This is a ratification process, which is not my business, even though the impact of non-ratification has a huge impact on the work that I'll need to do. But I've got to respect a sovereign parliament here. And I think that's important. But no, I'm confident that the Irish government will remain intact. We are due an election, but I think that'll happen in the first half of 2020, not in 2019. And that gives me the time and space to plan accordingly, particularly for Brexit, but hopefully for helping constructively in a process of getting devolved government back up and running here, and working the North-South institutions, and hopefully allowing a First and Deputy First Minister to start giving the kind of leadership that I know they want to give again in Stormont. So no, I'm pretty confident that the agreement, which is a formal agreement between Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil to extend the Commons and Supply Agreement well into 2020, gives us the certainty we need, even though the numbers in the Dáil would point to absolute instability. And of course, on Brexit, if Fine Gael in government, along with the independents, were to get Brexit management wrong, in my view, I think that Fianna Fáil and Sinn Féin would very quickly move to make life very difficult for us, because, of course, there's so much at stake here. So that keeps us under pressure, which is the way government should always be operating, but also I think gives us certainty. And I would say, while of course Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil have their differences and we have a very competitive relationship, while Fine Gael and Sinn Féin have their differences and we have a very competitive relationship too, the approach in Dublin generally in the Dáil towards Brexit and cooperation around Brexit, I think has been by and large very mature and supportive of what the government's trying to do.
Second referendum question, and before we go to
the other question you asked was, the other two ones.
Second referendum,
second referendum question. Look, I can totally understand calls for a second referendum. My job is to respond to a British government position. So I'm in the Irish government. We have been part of a negotiation here along with Michel Barnier and his team. We've got a deal through that negotiation process, which I believe is a compromise that can work for everybody. So it's not really my job to speculate or to encourage other movements or other aspirations. If I was to do that, I'd be accused of interfering in British politics in a very irresponsible way. Others can have their say on that. I think it's self-evident. I really regret that the United Kingdom is leaving the European Union. I think it's a bad decision for everybody. I wish they were staying. I wish they'd changed their mind. But I've got to respect that decision. And I believe there is a withdrawal agreement that can help to manage the consequences of that decision in a way that protects us on this island to the maximum extent possible. And my job is to see that through. If the British Parliament decides to move in a different direction, well, then we will have to respond to that. And if they vote for another referendum, we'll have to respond to that. But at the moment, what we are responding to is a deal that the British Prime Minister is debating and looking to try to get ratified in the Parliament over the next week. And that is what we are trying to provide reassurance to help her do. In terms of the Irish government's role in Brexit, look, Brexit is not an Irish policy. It's not an initiative that we were part of. It's something we don't want, but whether we like it or not, it has a deep impact on this island and on both sides of the border. And my job and the Taoiseach's job is to try to ensure that we protect Irish interests, north and south, as best we can, given the responsibilities and obligations that we have as co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, but also, obviously, that we have towards an all-island economy and how it functions and so on. We have always been focused, I hope, on the well-being of this island as a whole in the context of Brexit. I'm not sure that some of the hardline Brexiteers, I'm not talking about politicians from Northern Ireland now, I'm talking about some of the others, have ever really thought about the consequences for Northern Ireland of their decision and their aspirations for what they want for the future in terms of Britain's place and role in the world and so on. But it's our job to make sure that they're forced to think about that. This is the inconvenient truth with the vision that they have, that we have to face a very complex political environment in Northern Ireland that is fragile and that needs protection and support. And I hope that the Irish government has tried to do that. And I'm sure sometimes we've maybe overstepped or overreached, and we've upset people. But I think my motives are genuine, and I hope people will take them as that.
Okay, time has beaten us, so apologies to those people that didn't get to ask a question. We've had a very, very good debate tonight, and ladies and gentlemen, please show your appreciation again for An Taoiseach Simon Coveney.